One thing, and that's just something I kept thinking about the whole 12 days we were gone. I did not mention it. We use Arabic numerals. Very important. These are Arabic numerals as opposed to Roman numerals.
What I liked about the Crusades was how when they said they were doing the Crusade, they went out too early and they started pillaging like the whole time in Europe on the way
The
down.
Crusades have their bad side, but I want to. Yes.
I heard the crusade, like they just mostly hired the people that weren't doing anything at the time, meaning they hired a bunch of.
It was
Well,
like
actually,
a lot of
kings went along. I mean, that's not altogether true. That was true maybe in the first one. But ultimately, they the
learned
Pope
from the
allowed
first
criminals
one.
to go free if they participated. But wound up, kings went along, high nobles went along.
This is like a famous.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But they went in the wrong season and there was no crops, so that meant there was no food for the
Yeah,
Jews
that
down,
too.
which meant they pillaged the
The
villages
whole
all the way down.
thing, I mean, there was the Crusades, you might be talking one crusade, the Crusades lasted 200 years.
Yeah. The first one.
From 1095 to 1290, then came the Black Death, and Europeans had to stop. Slightly less than half here.
Is the April 13th due date the early turn-in or the regular?
That's the regular turn-in. Early turn-in. All right, I'm glad you asked. Yeah. Again, I would urge you to turn it in. I mean, that 6 points may sound like so little, but that will raise your average by 1.5 points, which rounds up to 2 points. And in 1 out of 5 cases, it will raise your grade by a letter. So it does matter. Of course, if you have an A+ average anyway, which some of you do. But then again, you might get sick or something and your average drop off or something come up unexpectedly. All right, slightly more than half of you here. That's better than the other class. They wound up having 8 students show up out of the 22 that are registered. What's going on with that?
People were still out of town from spring break.
But that spring fever, we used to call it spring fever.
I just worked.
No. All right, I had a case, something that had not happened to me in 6 years teaching. One young lady in the other class walked in and said, Mr. Cunningham, you made an obvious mistake on my grade. You gave me a grade of 120 points. And I said, no, I did not make a mistake. Your grade was so much better than the grades of your classmates that I wound up giving you giving a big curve. I said, if I hadn't, your classmates would make 20 points less than did, so I just gave you the 20 points and left them out. I was tempted to give them what they made. In her case, she'd have made 100% anyway. I said, no, you actually earned 120 points. So I gave you and I made no mistake. Anyway, that doesn't happen very often. It has occasionally have a case where that one student towers head and shoulders above everybody else in the class. All right, now, I spent a whole 12 days with this gone thinking, whatever I do, I mustn't forget this. Very important, folks. I mean, the number system that we use is called Arabic numerals because it apparently was invented by the Arabs. And of course, very importantly, I did mention this, it contains the number 0. Without Arabic numerals, you cannot do complex mathematics. I mean, they had what's called an abacus. Abacus was like a crude computer. Yeah, some of you might have played with it when you were kids. Crude computers that could count. But with Arabic numerals, you can teach 9-year-olds how to do long division, some of them anyway. And you can add and multiply fractions and divide fractions and add and multiply decimals. You can multiply large numbers. Again, we're using Arabic numerals as opposed to Roman numerals. On some clocks, you will still see Roman numerals, but so you need to know your Roman numerals. But we are using Arabic numerals because without it, again, try to program a computer using Roman numerals, and well, the results are disastrous. So, all right. All right, now hopefully all of you noticed this. The test is next Monday. All right, I want to say this about the test. Because I've devoted half the lecture time, or will devote half the lecture to Islam, half the test is Islam. The other fourth of the test is Africa, and the other fourth of the test is the American Indians. But half the test is Islam. Papers, all right, obviously do, oh yeah, 1,000 words as called out in the syllabus and in the instructions. The computer will count. When I grade the papers, the first thing I check for is there a title page? That's a few points off if it isn't. Is there bibliography? And then what is the word count, and are the pages numbered? 4 things: word count, and again, Turnitin counts the words. Oh yeah, I also check for plagiarism. Plagiarism count is too high. You and I will need to talk. I've been fairly lenient with it. I have asked students to do papers over, or I have on the syllabus, I'll dock your grade by a certain amount. Now, if you say, oh, I have a whole lot of direct quotes, yeah, explain to me, if you have a plagiarism count above 50%, you need to explain to me why. Now, if you decide to do a whole lot of direct quotes, I can understand. Now, one thing, I mean, this may sound kind of corny, but when I see a paper with a plagiarism count of 0, I always dread grading it. It shows originality, all right, but it's usually a super poorly written paper that I'm going to have to spend a lot of the time knocking off a whole lot of points for. And I just kind of dread looking at it. Maybe that's usually the case. Plagiarism count of 0. Or really, so basically, I mean, don't get upset if your plagiarism count is 8 or 10%. Turnitin doesn't care. I don't care. 10, 12, 14, 15, 16% means nothing. But a plagiarism count of 40 or 50%, that's something. All right. Anybody have any questions? Comments? Okay.
Is this
No, oh, I'm glad you asked that. I had told you the next test would be multiple choice. But look at it turned out last fall I'd written up one that is the format of the first 2 tests we took. It will not be multiple choice. It will be, I mean, where you have about 30 definitions, words to define. Words define words like Bering Strait. And I had one student from another country, what is a Bering Strait? I said the word strait means among other things, I mean, it means a line that doesn't have a curve. That's one thing straight means. It also means a small, narrow body of water between 2 bigger bodies of water. There's a strait in Gibraltar that joins the Atlantic Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea. Some of you know, you like to know what I'm talking about. The Bering Strait, all right, goes between Alaska and Siberia. A narrow body of water that joins together 2 bigger bodies of water. But basically, I want you to define it. Not only define, but tell where it is, where that's happened. If it's a person, tell where this person lived. If it's a idea or religion, tell me which people practice this religion. Now, one of the questions will be on the test, and folks, this is one of the things that makes a lot of students get a really high grade on this test because almost everybody can answer it. Here's the question. Give me 5 areas where Islam conflicts with the United States Constitution. You actually can think of a bunch of them. That's one of the questions you'll see on the test. It's a bonus question.
Second, you said question again?
Give me 5 areas where that Islam conflicts with, or you want to say disagrees with, the United States Constitution. What's that? At the bottom of the test, there will be some possible answers, just like it was the first one. Keywords, not really. I mean, I'll give you a word and I expect you to define it. Or give you a place and expect you to tell me where it is, or a concept and expect you to tell me where it's located. In other words, like for Bering Strait, if you get that question, I don't know if you'll get it with the other class, or if you get it, by all means mention it. Almost is between Alaska and Siberia. Basically tell where. And if you get Mecca on a test, tell me at least that it's in Arabia. I mean, Mecca is famous because it's the birthplace of Islam. Tell me it's in Arabia at least. You know, where applicable, give place names. All right. But I'm really glad you asked that. No, it's not multiple choice this time. Anybody else? Okay, we'll move on. I left off last time with the Crusades. All right. When I was in graduate school, I had a professor who was one of the world's top 5 experts on the Crusades. He's deceased now, Dr. Harold Fink by name. He even wrote an article in Encyclopedia Britannica on the Crusades. He was hard, dead set against them. And over the holidays, I read the history book that I used then, a book written in the 1930s about the Crusades, and they devoted 2 or 3 pages telling the good that came out of them or the cons. We are going to run into the Crusades later, but when we come to European histories. For now, I'm going to mention them and not go into real depth. Essentially, the Crusades were where a bunch of Europeans got together and took the offensive against Islam. In other words, instead of waiting before the Crusades, Islam was taking over a lot of Spain. Islam was taking over a lot of the Byzantine Empire. Islam was making a lot of inroads. Well, the Crusades was where Europeans, you might say, grabbed the ball and became the offense instead of the defense. Instead of waiting for the enemy to come to them, they took up the they took up the offense against the Muslims. There have been people who have apologized to the Muslims of the Crusades. But someone else I read recently wrote, I think we have to apologize for that apology, that Western Europe owes no apology to Islam. Why not? Because Islam's avowed goal was to conquer the whole world. And Western Europe decided you're not going to do it. So Europe took up the offensive. All right. The Crusades were to last for 200 years. Essentially, folks, the dates are 1095 to 1290. That's 195 years. There were actually, if you count every crusade that was started, about 200 crusades altogether during this 195-year period, of which these crusades, only 4 of them were really, well, 9 of them actually got to the Holy Land, so they were successful that they actually got there. But only 4 of them are really important. We'll name the 4 later, but of all of them, the only one that was really a true military success for Europe was the first one. The first crusade caught the Muslim world off guard and by surprise. Essentially, what happened was the Pope, the Emperor, the Byzantine Emperor, asked Europe for help. He said, these Turks are coming in over my realm and I don't have the means to fight them off. Will you Europeans please come and help me fight the Muslims? Now, he had another word for them, but I won't use that word. I mean, I'll just call them fight the Muslims. So they fought they went. The Pope decided to let persons who would join the Crusades out of jail. People who were deep in debt were promised forgiveness for their debts. They were promised forgiveness for all sins if they took up the cross, and the Crusaders would put the cross on their chest and on their shields to show they were Crusaders. The First Crusade did not have any kings leading it. It did have some nobles, French noblemen. It was the most French nobleman, Count Raymond, the Count of Raymond of Toulouse, and let's see, there were a few others, but they caught the Muslim world by surprise. They went into the Holy Land. They captured Acre. Don't worry about it. The main thing was they captured Jerusalem. And they set up a kingdom in Jerusalem called the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was destined to last about 100 years. Now, to this day, there were two people in Europe who hold the title King of Jerusalem that they claim they inherited from their ancestors. One of them is the King of Spain, King Juan Carlos, and the other one is some Habsburg who's no longer a king, but just a pretend king, I believe King of Romania or something like that in there, the King of Austria. But no longer a king, because a lot of European countries have gotten rid of the kings. But the King of Spain still holds the title, King of Jerusalem, but Europeans lost Jerusalem some 700-800 years ago. Anyway, this was the only crusade. It was a military success. Later crusades were even led by kings. The Second Crusade was led by 2 kings. The Third Crusade started off being led by 3 kings, and so on and so forth. Eventually, Europe had to give up the crusading zeal, owing to the fact that in 1307, 17 years after this last crusade, the Black Death hit Europe, and Europe was in no condition to, Europe was starving and famine and diseased. And Europe was in no condition to take up arms and fight fight a holy war. Now, I want to jump ahead in the history a little bit. While Europeans did not succeed in driving out Islam or in keeping the Holy Land, they initially took it with them. While they did not succeed, fast forward, and Europeans began to develop better gunpowder, better rifles, better artillery, cannon that could shoot a lot farther, better ships. Then eventually Europe developed a steam engine, then the automobile and the airplane. To make a long story short, later on, European countries were to conquer almost all of Islam. Great Britain conquered Egypt. Italy conquered Libya. Morocco escaped, but Arabia escaped. But almost every Muslim country was conquered by some European country at one time or another. France got Syria, Iraq, and Iran, and the French still have interest in these places. France also got Algeria. France got most of the Sahara Desert. If you look on a really old map, the type of maps I looked at when I was a kid, it showed the Sahara as being part of French West Africa, French, and the Sudan was the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan because Great Britain had Africa. The Islamic world fell far and far behind. Today, you still hear references made to crusades. Billy Graham would call his episodes into a city a crusade. But also, the Islamic world will complain when Western nations send their armies to fight ISIS. You're leading another crusade just like you did before. Islam has not forgotten the Crusades. And even though I'll say this, if Europeans had never taken up arms against Islam, Islam would still hate us because they hate each other and hate everybody around them. They hate each other worse than they hate non-Islamic people. If you don't like what I'm saying, folks, I got to tell you, I don't like it either. You're welcome to dissent. You're welcome to disagree. I won't argue with you. I'll let you say your piece. Anybody? All right. Anyway, like I say, we'll keep the Crusades in mind. We'll be talking more about them later. But essentially, the Europeans took up the offensive to fight against people who had vowed to destroy them, but they simply, you might say, grabbed the ball and started running into their territory instead of saying we're going to stop the 50-yard line. So they said we're going to go deeper. All right, so much for the Crusades for now. Now, there have been, well, I'm going to list some of them, there have been many groups of Mongolians who have come over. First of all, there were the Huns, the Magyars, the Avars, the Finns, the Bulgars, and finally, the Turks. And finally, the Mongolians themselves. Now, all these people, keep in mind, we're Mongolian, but only these people don't have a distinctive name. We just call them Mongolians. The Huns, of course, wound up in Hungary. The Magyars in the same place. The Bulgars in what we today call Bulgaria. The Finns wound up in Finland. The Avars, I believe, wound up close to Finland also. I don't know much about them. The Turks wound up in what is today Turkey. This is, if you know anything about the land of Mongolia, it's a lot like Arabia, except Arabia doesn't have any winters as such. It's much more of a subtropical, tropical climate. Mongolia, though, does have spring, summer, and winter. It has cold weather, but Mongolia is located in the very heart of the world's largest continent, and oftentimes there's very little rainfall. In fact, typically when two Mongolians meet, two tribes meet, one of them will say that has rain fallen on your place here. That's a typical greeting they have for each other. Well, the dry conditions would oftentimes force these people to move, and of course, if any of you know about human nature, poor people, and the Mongolians are poor people oftentimes tend to have a whole lot of children. That might sound like the reverse of what should be, but it's just simply the way life is. These Mongolian peoples would have lots of children, and the population would in short order get so large that their country could not handle them. They might fight among themselves, and the losers move out. So basically, these people are losers in their own land of Mongolia. And they came from Mongolia mostly toward Europe, angry and with intent to conquer and to destroy. Now, the last of them was led by a ruler named Genghis Khan. I had a pupil tell me one time there was a computer game out where they matched up all these great military leaders and tried to put them on an even field. Now granted, of course, they all typically used tanks and planes to fight with. But they tried to figure out now which one of these men was the greatest of all the military leaders. And they came up, usually who came out on top, Alexander the Great and Genghis Khan. But of all the world's great conquerors, and again I'm talking about Alexander the Great, Genghis Khan, Cyrus the Great, Julius Caesar, and well, in modern time Napoleon. Now, in modern times, all these conquerors have wound up defeated. In olden times, they weren't. Now, today's world, Napoleon wound up defeated, Hitler wound up defeated, Genghis Khan did not. But of all of them, Genghis Khan is the only one you can truly say grew up in poverty. His father was an impoverished nobleman, but his father was poisoned when he was 10. And all the men in the tribe left, so Genghis Khan led around what was left of his tribe, which was him and mostly a bunch of women who were feeble, like old men. But when he grew up, he allied himself with some of the other tribes and then did what nobody had done in the memory of Mongolians. In fact, we don't know if ever done. He wound up uniting all of Mongolia into one big country. I mean, it shows something about what he had in the way of ability as a leader. He unified the Mongolians. Then he decided that Mongolia was not enough for him, so he headed into China and partially conquered China. Now, we're going to talk about Chinese history in chapter 11, I believe. All right, here's what was wrong with China. China had millions of people, and Genghis Khan hesitated. You know, he only had an army of about 100,000 men. And to go into China, but here's what the problem was with China at the time. China had a socialistic dynasty with Song. The socialistic dynasty was great as far as promoting the arts and literature and music, all of which is a part of life and should be promoted, and they were terrible militarily. They saw no reason for an army. So first of all, they lost Tibet, which the previous dynasty had conquered. Then Genghis Khan came in, and instead of fighting, they scattered. Now, I did not argue it. I had a pupil tell me that, well, Genghis Khan was such a great leader that no one could have withstood him anyway. I have to disagree with that. I think if the Chinese would have gotten together a bunch of highly trained, practically select troops, they could have whipped them. I mean, you know, with more than 1 million men to pick from, and I'm talking about men only, and actually they probably had 4 or 5 million men. If Genghis Khan had 100,000, if they could have picked 200,000 or 300,000 of their absolute best horsemen and made a highly trained, they could have put them against Genghis Khan's men 100,000 time and 3 way, 100,000 engaged for about 15 to 30 minutes, then withdraw. Then we'll send the next 100,000 in before before the enemy has a chance to rest. Let them fight for about 15 minutes, then blow a trumpet and get them to withdraw. And before the enemy has time to rest, send the third 100,000 men in. I have no doubts that they won. Instead, what they do, well, the general saw he couldn't win, committed suicide. The emperor fled. I mean, you know, I remember I first read about Genghis Khan when I was 11 years old. And then I ran into the same book when I was in graduate school, and I discussed my boss at UT. He said, oh yeah, that's a famous classic. So I reread it. And of course, it's amazing when you read the book when you're 11 and turn around and read it again when you're 22. There's a whole lot more you can do because you know a whole lot more about life. And I guarantee you, I could almost probably read it again. Same book, but I mean, Genghis Khan organized his army into squads of 10. He said, anybody who leaves a squad of 10 will be executed. You stay with that squad no matter what. And all of you fight as a team. The enemy will never fight against one of you. But again, folks, I believe with a properly trained army, the Chinese could have whipped him. But that's speculation. Leave that as what it may. He partially did not conquer all of China. Partially conquered China. Again, China is a huge territory. Instead, he turned his attention toward the west, and he crossed the vast Himalayan mountains and went into the Muslim world. Well, this may sound gross, but I'll tell you what kind of men he had fighting with him. See, for nourishment, the men would open up the veins of their donkeys, suck some blood out of the donkeys, and then close the vein back up so the donkeys would survive and where they could drink more blood later. This was the way they nourished themselves as they went across the mountains. They didn't do that to their fighting horses. They went to fight with their top strength with their donkey. Now, something else that they did not realize was happening. A whole bunch of rats were following the outfit. And these rats were to bring the Black Death to the Islamic world and ultimately to Europe. But again, the Mongolians did not seem to know that. And the Mongolians were pretty tough anyway. Anyway, when Genghis Khan came to the Muslim world, he began to just mercilessly slaughter for the sheer fun of something. Your book talked about how he said, I just enjoy killing the men and then hugging the women afterwards and hugging all the pretty girls. I mean, to him, this gave him a real thrill, hugging the women as they weep over their dead. To him, and one time, he thought he'd destroyed a city, but then some people were hiding in basements. He got the word that, hey, there are people still alive in the city, so he turned around and went back and finished off the people who had survived, just for really nothing more than the sheer fun of killing. Really, he would have destroyed Islam. That would have been the end of Islam, except for one thing. His army converted to Islam itself. But he found the Islamic world, again, like the Crusaders, had found the Islamic world completely unprepared for him. The Europeans were terrified. I mean, the word got to Europe that, hey, there's a great king coming from the east who just simply wipes out everything in sight. They remind them a lot of the days of Attila the Hun. But Genghis Khan wasn't there really so much to conquer as he was just there just for the fun of killing. He also said that God appointed me to do this because of your sins. But Attila the Hun had said the same thing until Attila wound up being defeated. But Genghis Khan himself was not defeated. Genghis Khan wound up going home. Eventually he died. His grave has not been seen to this day. The persons who buried him were all mercilessly killed. And a bunch of hundreds of thousands of horsemen rode over the plains where he was buried to obliterate any trace of his tomb. We do not know where he was buried. His tomb has not yet been found. Now, we found some tombs of famous people, including the tomb of Clovis's father, and a big, magnificent tomb in Great Britain that we don't know who it belonged to. But we have found some magnificent tombs. We found Philip of Macedon's tomb. Alexander the Great's tomb we never found. Anyway, Genghis Khan goes down in history for his extreme brutality. The Mongolians, after they had partially conquered China, later Genghis Khan's grandson Kublai Khan, I'll deal with him, I won't write his name down now, but Kublai Khan was to finish conquering China, and the Mongolians were to adopt the ways of the people whom they conquered. They were to civilize them. They were to become civilized themselves. And they became a lot like who they conquered. They adopted Islam and became a lot like the Islamic people. And somehow Islam and the Mongolians, the religions, were very suited to each other. Eventually the Mongol Empire disintegrated. But they had brought an end to the Arab Empire as such. The Arab Empire was destined to lay dormant for hundreds upon hundreds of years. Genghis Khan lived about the 1100s until the latter part of the 1900s. The Arab world was destined to languish way behind, to be conquered by one country after another, to spend a lot of their time fighting among themselves, and in general accomplish nothing in the way of arts, literature, mathematics, astronomy. And they started out great, but they were destined to become fragmented, disintegrated, and fall behind. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about is, what do Muslims believe? Start off with, they believe there's only one God, and Allah is his prophet, or there's only one God, Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. That's their starting point. So basically they're monotheist. Now, here's something now, folk, that your book says differently from what's proven to be true. I mean, the authors wrote maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and also, I have to admit, I never did get the latest edition of their books. Some of you have an 8th edition. But, all right, the issue is, do Muslims spread their religion by fire and sword? Your authors simply say Muslims deny that they spread their religion by fire and sword, and I leave it at that. In recent times, I'm talking very recent, like the last 2 years, there are groups of Islamic people who definitely spread their religion by fire and sword, and folks, it's only been like 2 or 3 days ago, our Secretary of State publicly, for the first time, accused accused ISIS of genocide. I mean, that is the terrorist. Now, down through the ages, I mean, ISIS has only been around for about 3 or 4 years at most. Down through the ages, have they spread religion by fire and sword? Here's the best answer I can give. It depends on the time, it depends on the place. In some places and sometimes they have. Now, I had a young man from India who insisted that Pakistan was conquered by fire and sword. I looked it up and found out in some cases they used fire, and it depended on the ruler, it depended on the time, and sometimes, you can't just make a blanket statement that applies to all 1,400 years of the history. So sometimes they definitely did, and sometimes they didn't. Pakistan appears to me to have been conquered much by fire and sword. And they tried to conquer southern Europe, particularly the Balkan region, by fire and sword. But I had a young man from Mali last semester who said that the country of Mali, the African country of Mali, was conquered by persuasion, not by fire and sword. I'm not going to argue with him. I don't know that much about Muslim history or Mali's history to argue with him. They appeared to outsiders to be guilty of fire and sword, while at the same time they themselves deny they use force. And folks, this is a big part of human nature. What is obvious to everybody else that a person is doing, that person does not see themselves as doing it. All right, I'm reminded of Puritans in our own country's history. The Puritans would really criticize, all right, I'll call the name, the Catholics, that you Catholics are guilty of uniting church and state. Well, guess what? Guess who was uniting church and state worse than the Catholics? The Puritans themselves. But the Puritans also state, you people are guilty of practicing justification by works. Well, guess who was more guilty of practicing justification by works? They say they claimed they believed in justification by faith, but actually nobody practiced justification by works more than the Puritans themselves. And nobody in this country united church and state more than the Puritans themselves. And yet they criticized other religious groups for, you join church and state and we don't. Yes, you do. You people practice justification by works. We practice justification by faith. No, you practice justification by works more than anybody else. The Muslims, they have to outsiders appeared to be spreading the religion by fire and sword. To them, they would say, oh no, we never use force. Now, they have allowed Christian and Jewish communities to exist within Muslim lands, but much too often it has been with Christians and Jewish people being second-class citizens. In a lot of places there have been rules that a Jew or a Christian cannot ride on the back of a beast because this might put him higher than Muslims. You could tell a Jewish or Christian home because they were only so high, and Muslims' homes were allowed to be built higher. Then again, to tell everybody that the Muslims are superior. Also, Christians men were not allowed to wear a tall hat that only Muslim men were allowed to wear, again, because the tall hat might make a Christian appear to be taller than a Muslim man. And they wanted the Muslims to be taller, so the Muslims men only wore the, particularly this was true in Turkey, the Muslim men only wore the Turkish fez. Now in the 1920s, some ruler took over, an Islamic ruler took over Turkey and said, nobody may wear the fez. And he said, I want to be able to walk down the streets and not be able to tell a Christian from a Muslim. Again, what he was doing, he was trying to get Turkey recognized as a European country because Turkey was looked on as an outcast by other European countries. But anyway, they also gave a special tax against Christians called a jizya, which was designed to keep Christians more poor than Muslims because Muslims did not pay that particular tax. Now, of course, Muslims were taxed. Oh, taxing everybody does. It has to pay that. Now, weirdly enough, in their religion, they believe in righteousness. Well, I mean, I have no quarrel with that. They believe in punishment for the wicked. But, and here's the one unique feature of their religion, they have no real provision for forgiveness. Now, I had a Muslim man speak up at this point in my lecture and say, oh yeah, they believe if you stop sinning, you will eventually be forgiven. That is not really written down. That might be something, but that's not written in their Quran. In the Quran, it's just all righteousness and punishment if you're not righteous, with practically no provision for forgiveness. Now, once an American visited a Muslim country and he got made friends with some Muslims, and these Muslims, now you must avoid that man there. He's a camel thief. Yeah, Stay away. He comes from a long line of camel thieves. But when the American inquired farther, he found that this man's ancestor had stolen a camel 800 years ago. And the Muslim people had never forgotten about it from that time till this. And all his male descendants down the line were camel thieves. Even though it's probably none of them had ever stolen a camel from 300 years. The Muslims seemed to be a little bit embarrassed to finally tell what made this man a camel thief. But there were basically, there's no provision for forgiveness. No, nothing but unlasting judgment. Now, they have no assurance of a happy afterlife, with one exception. If you die in a holy war, you are then promised 70 virgins, or 72, depending on who you read. You're promised 72 virgins if you die in a holy war. Now, somebody might well ask, well, what about the women? Okay, I've got something to tell you a bit about the women. But Mohammed did not believe that women even had a soul, and therefore women did not have an afterlife. The 72 virgins were mind-numbed zombies that was created especially for the men who deserved or who had earned them. But they were not women who had lived on earth. Mohammed did not believe that women had an afterlife. Now, if you've heard otherwise or heard differently, your comments are welcome. But I have heard this about, yes? Do you have a comment?
So if a person who died in the Holy War got the 13 women, why would they need them?
What?
If the person is already dead.
Say, oh, if a person did, well, okay, we're talking about the next life. You know, he would die in this life, and then his soul would go to the next life, where he'd have access to these women, and he'd live in a mansion and have all these trees. And Islam has a lot to say about trees, even though the Islamic world contains very, very few trees. But they'd have these shade trees, and they'd have the eternal breezes blowing on them, and 72 virgins to wait on them. But these are not virgins who had lived on earth. These would be creations that Allah had created just specially for them, but not women who had lived on earth. That's my understanding now. So other than if you died in a jihad, there was no provision, no assurance of salvation. It is known that Muhammad once said, I wonder if Allah will have me. Well, he was Allah's prophet. I mean, you'd think he would be assured of a happy afterlife. Well, he wasn't. Their women are expected to be completely subservient to men. They are looked on as being a man's property, the property of their father when they're in their father's house, and then the property of their husband when they're husband's house. And they're expected to dress with extreme modesty, in some cases to the point of even covering their entire bodies, including their hands and their face, and wearing a veil. And this has brought them in some conflict with the Western world, owing to the fact that Western law requires that everybody show their face when having a picture made with a driver's license. The Muslim women took these cases to court in some Western courts, and every Western court ruled, well, when you have your picture of your driver's license, you cannot wear the veil. It's just something we require. You must throw back your veil, let us take a picture of your face, and then we can issue your driver's license. Otherwise, we cannot issue your driver's license. Now, I want to say this, though, about their women. It is the women who sent a religion from one generation to the next. This is a known fact, and Islam is no exception. While the men are out busy either fighting wars or earning a living, the women are the ones who spend the time with the children, and they're the ones who teach the children their religious doctrines. Now, here's what really has the Muslim world terrified. If they lose their women, their whole religion is lost. Well, how would they lose their women? Simply, here's how. Western ideas are creeping in spite of their attempts. I mean, we have the internet, we have shortwave radio, we have television, we have satellite radio and satellite TV, and also we have travel. And if these women get the idea that, hey, Western women can get their driver's license, why can't we? Western women can go out and get a job and earn money and be independent, be their own boss, why can't we? If they do, the Islamic men are terrified. They will lose their women, and their religion, whole religion, will be lost. Now, this is one thing that could conceivably happen. They are very, very much afraid of just that very thing happening. Also, yes, in the Western world, women are allowed to divorce their husbands. We had a Muslim man hired in at Lockheed many years ago. As far as I know, he's still there. He's now a supervisor. He hired him from Pakistan. I mean, Lockheed would hire these foreigners in an attempt to get them to buy our airplanes. Well, this man was from a Pakistani nobleman. He came over here. His wife brought his wife with him. His wife became Americanized, and his wife divorced him. In American law, that's permissible. In Islamic law, but he was not living in an Islamic country in America, so his wife divorced him. He went back home where his brother arranged another marriage. His father was dead, so his brother was now the oldest son of the Pakistani nobleman. His brother arranged a marriage for him. He came back with his new wife. As far as I know, he's still living with his new wife. This is a very, very tough issue that they have to face. All right, as they are today, and I'm talking now about March 21st, 2016, they're moving into European countries by the millions. The idea that some of them have is that we can move in and eventually take over because our women are having 6 to 8 babies per woman, and European women are averaging less than 1.5 babies per woman. Keep in mind, in order for today's medicine, in order for a population to remain just stable, women need to have 2.1 babies per woman. This is in your book later in your book. Not one Western country averages that. Not one. Muslim countries, folk let these people into their country like Sweden, like Norway, like Spain. 50 years later, and folk, I have a lot of memories here. 50 years ago, I was trying to get my driver's license. I was younger than a lot of you. I was attending Madison High School. Had a shootout recently. Within 50 years, they will have taken over Europe because Europeans will have died off, largely died off, and the Muslims will have averaged 8 babies per woman. I mean, hey, I'll tell you something, just a couple generations, one couple might have 8 children and 50 or more grandchildren. And then 300 or 400 great-grandchildren. And within 50 years, the great-great-grandchildren number into the thousands. Fundamental mathematics. But what they're afraid of is what if along the way, though, they adopt Western ideas and Western customs and Western ways. This is where they could lose. Now, another reason they can lose is the same reason they've lost their wars all throughout history. They start fighting among themselves. And that's what has gone on from the very shortly after Muhammad died until this day. Right now we have Egypt is still fighting Egypt, Syria is fighting Syria, Libya is fighting Libya, Yemen is fighting Yemen. What all else? They're fighting among themselves. It is known that had they united, they would have driven Israel into the sea. They could not unite. So Israel survived because they spent a lot of time. This has been going on for 1,200 years, folk. They fight among themselves a lot. Now, they do not believe in card playing, games of chance. They do not believe in rolling dice. And with all due respect to them, I want to say this about card playing can become highly addictive. Gambling can become so addictive you can lose everything you have. I mean, there is some merit to a lot of this. But again, the difference between me and them is I think these issues are better off left up to each individual to decide for himself and herself and not be decided by Big Brother looking over a shoulder and saying you can't do this, you can't drink, you can't smoke. Hey, in my personal life, I've outlawed drinking, I've outlawed tobacco. That's my decision. Hopefully you have too. I mean, if you have it, you're going to find out tobacco is a very, very expensive habit to take. Not to mention, it shortens your life. I mean, I've had a 10-year argue. I know this person who smokes and lived to be 100. I mean, there are persons who do it. Nobody knows why. Some people can smoke, chain smoke, and live to be 105. But statistically, for most people, it shortens their lives. Statistically, for most people, it leads to a highly increased rate of cancer. I mean, again, this can hardly be argued with anymore. We have computers, we have statistics. But again, I still say, this decision should be left up to each individual to decide for himself or herself. All right, I'll pause. Anybody have any comments? All right. Now, oh yes, something that the other class and most Georgia students do not know. Right, every one of you probably know that for a Christian church to set up a prayer room in a public school is illegal. Christian churches can put campuses on public elementary school or high schools, but there are prayer rooms in public schools. Now, several years ago, I was teaching at Powder Springs School, and my wife bumped into one of my pupils, it turned out. This was one of my star pupils, and he said, we didn't know if we believed Mr. Cunningham or not until we looked it up. What you do is look up for Muslim prayer rooms, public schools. The Muslims are set up prayer rooms in numerous public schools in New York State, Michigan, and California, among other places. And the ACLU has never, ever said one word against it. Some teachers will teach their pupils Muslim prayers, and the ACLU never utters the word of protest. Now, folks, this is an extreme taxpayer expense. Keep in mind, I want to tell you something about Muslim prayer rooms. They have to be carpeted. You have to put in plumbing, because these Muslims want to wash their feet before they go in and pray. They also, you have to have something about that points toward Mecca. I don't know which, because they always pray 5 times a day facing toward Mecca. Now, here's the big catch-22. They have to put up 2 of them. One for the men and one for the women. All this will cost the public school system hundreds of thousands of dollars every time you put one in. And most Americans do not even know they are there. Look it up. I did. You don't see them here in Georgia, but I mean, now, I'm going to ask for sure. How many of you have ever heard this outside of now? 1 of you, 2 of you have heard it. Okay, 2 of you heard it yet. This is actually going on. All right, now, speaking of liberals, folks. Sharia law. All right, I got that written down right here. All right, Sharia law. Oh, yeah, right here, right here. All right. All of you, I think, knows. You know, all of you probably know what Islam does to homosexuals. Islam kills homosexuals. American liberals claim homosexuality is an acceptable alternate. When an Islamic country kills a homosexual, the liberals do not put a word of protest. In America, the liberals claim that women are equal. When a Muslim country stoned a woman to death for the crime of adultery, they don't do that to men, only women. The liberals never utter a word of protest. Again, when they set up prayer rooms in public schools, the liberals never utter a word of protest. It's like this, folks. Well, I was taught when I was in school, the extreme left and extreme right, you might think they're worlds apart. Actually, the extremes will come together often, and they will join each other. And both of them are closer to each other than either one of them are to the middle. Again, some of you probably heard, you know this already, but it seems almost like liberal and Islam goes hand in hand. And yet they seem to be on the opposite ends of the totem pole. All right, Sharia law. Again, Sharia law calls for, among other things, executing homosexuals, stoning women who commit adultery. Speaking of adultery, I mean, I must say this. Muhammad allowed the men to have 4 wives. Now, a lot of Muslim sheiks and high, richer Muslims, men wind up with more than that. Women are only allowed to have 1 husband. The men up to 4 wives. Now, most Muslim men only have 1 wife because, I guess, economics. But where the men are allowed to have more. Again, Sharia law calls for stoning women who commit adultery. Sharia law says that anybody who converts out of Islam to any other religion should be executed. This is extremely important because in the land of Egypt, they took a poll when Egypt killed its leader and was still trying to find its way. Sharia law also says that persons should be forcibly converted to Islam. But anyway, when they took a poll, they found out that 75 to 80% of Egyptian people, or at least Egyptian men, believe that Sharia law should be enforced in all of Islam. So this is not, folks, just a radical extremist group. This is mainstream fundamental Islam.
Like the actual definition of Sharia law, is that actually like putting a death notice on some sort of like act or person or something?
Say that more.
Like the actual definition of what Sharia law means, like what it is.
Yeah.
Is it like actually like putting a death notice on like a person or an actual act or something like that?
That's, I tell you, I don't know enough about that part of it to comment, except so much of what I do know about it calls for the death penalty for dissenters, for disagreeers. So I guess that you're on the right track. You either agree with me or be killed. Anyone else? Now, again, you have persons who will say that, oh, all these terrorist acts are only done by the extremists. And it's just a few of them that are the extremists. I still say the problem, the real problem, is not the extremists. The real problem is Islam itself. That religion has gone for hundreds of years without contributing anything to the fields of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, literature, physics, chemistry, technology, not a thing. That's a shame because they started off, they were ahead. They were ahead of Europeans in the fields of medicine, astronomy. They got their knowledge of astronomy, a lot of it from the ancient world, and they passed it on to Europeans. Then Europeans took this knowledge and expounded on it. Just like Europeans took the knowledge from the Chinese and expounded on that, and then had a big technological and industrial revolution, while that the Islamic world was left behind. And while one reason I mentioned the Turks, when they took over, they had such a rigid interpretation of the Quran that they'd outlawed any form of dissent. Folk, to make progress, you have to allow dissent. You can't be a ruler and surround yourself with a bunch of yes men and expect to get anywhere. You have to surround yourself with men who are free to speak. And I used to feel sorry for Darius III, the king who opposed Alexander the Great, because Darius III, I mean, just seemed like he could not stand up to Alexander. Then I read where Darius III had advised that, sir, your majesty, you need to hire professional soldiers and pay them half your treasury just to get a big army of professional soldiers, and with them you can beat Alexander. Darius had that advisor cut to pieces. And I said, okay, Darius III deserved what he got. Mussolini, the Italian fame, of a couple of generations ago, surrounded himself with a bunch of yes men. You don't know what a yes man is. A man who agrees with everything the leader says, doesn't dare dissent. And again, if you read the sample paper I gave, and it was written by a Muslim young man from another college back in 2008, and he talked about how that in our country we have senators who disagree with our president. Oh, this, that, we actually do have senators. See, they're not allowed to dissent, so what they do instead is they lead rebellions and lead coups and overthrow them as when they can. Or another, all right, folks, now, here's something else I want to bring up. One of the things where the Islam disagrees with the United States Constitution, you wouldn't think of it at first, but the United States Constitution says when the president dies or resigns, the vice president takes over automatically. In the Islamic world, when the leader dies or is overthrown, who knows who's going to take over? They have a big power struggle, and the one who's still standing when the struggle is over with, he becomes a ruler. Basically, it just starts killing. Everybody starts killing everybody. At least the ones who want to be rulers starts killing each other off. When it's over with, one of them is left, he becomes the ruler. That's the way Islam has conducted itself for centuries. Now, if I'm wrong, tell me. All right. Now, again, when they created algebra in the 9th century, they developed the Arabic numeral system, very important. They developed the zero. And oh yes, they were once far ahead of Europeans in medicine. They had cures for diseases that Europeans didn't have. Today, the ones of them who can afford it, when they get really bad sick, they've gone to the United States to get help because their own medicine is not as good as ours. At one time, a Muslim would never come to a foreign, non-Muslim country to get help, but today they do. Again, here's a problem that religious people sometimes have, folk, with science. Science in its wanderings about, right, for instance, religion says that God created. Then science comes along and says evolution created. But then, I mean, more and more, the more I read about evolution, particularly as a result, in light of DNA evidence almost completely renders evolution impossible. All right, also, there's a passage in the Bible where Joshua told the sun to stand still. Today we say, oh no, the sun doesn't move, the earth does. Well, in 1905, Albert Einstein said that all motion is relative. So when it looks like the sun is moving from east to west across the sky from your position on earth, what you observe, the sun is in fact moving. Because all motion is relative anyway. Something else about science. When I was a kid, they taught us herbs are primitive. And we took off in the direction, herbs, we leave those behind. Now we have more knowledge. And guess what? You go to the drugstore today and what do you find? Herbs galore. We once thought they were primitive. Now, hey, a lot of us are taking herbs. Now be careful, folks. I mean, herbs can destroy your kidneys and cripple your herb. Be careful which one you take. But herbs have made a big comeback. And science goes back and forth. Now, there is another real problem with science that affects both Islam and Christianity. There are passages in the Quran and in the Bible that makes it look like the earth is flat. We have supposedly strongly, very strongly proven the earth is round. However, there is a group right now called the Flat Earth Society. They are recruiting numerous members. And you can laugh if you want to, but folk, their mathematics is such you really, truly cannot refute them. Adolf Hitler believed that the earth stood inside a sphere, and he would try to get on this part of the earth and observe what was going on here. He never did, but the moon was close to the center, but then we could not really see the center because everything got smaller and smaller. Mathematically, I mean, this may sound absurd, but believe me, mathematically you cannot disprove it. All right, now how could the earth be flat? All right, have any of you ever studied third and fourth and fifth dimensions? In a four-dimensional universe, looking back on a three-dimensional universe, everything would appear to be wide open, not to mention flat. I see one person who says, "God, I can understand what I'm saying." If the rest of you don't understand, I mean, think it through. All right, say, here's one dimension. Now get a two-dimensional world, and you know something? From a third-dimensional point of view, you can see this side at the same time you can see this side. You can see this side. Now, if this were a three-dimensional sphere, and you were looking at it from a four-dimensional perspective, your three-dimensional sphere would appear to be flat, and you could see all sides of it at once. Am I making sense, or am I talking above your heads? What? The flat Earth idea may likely come back. As we get more and more knowledge, we oftentimes go back to, hey, there's ancient people. How did they know this anyway? All right. But anyway, what they started, Christianity, the Christian world did hinder the development of science for a time, but did not stop it. Among Islam, the Islamic clerics completely halted and stopped their scientific progress because in places it appeared to conflict with the religion. The Chinese, they were advanced even more than Islam, but their philosophers came in and they stopped all scientific progress. This is in the records. It wasn't the emperors, it was their philosophers. They stopped all scientific progress. The Chinese, I mean, they were in a position, they could have conquered the whole globe, but they were stopped by their own intellect. Islam was hardly an exception. All right. I'm going to leave Islam for a while. Again, if it seems like I've been hard and harsh on Islam, I feel like I've said some things that really ought to be said. Nobody is above criticism. Nobody, no group is above having other people point out their faults and mistakes. So I've had people point out mine, and it's not fun and it's not pleasant. Sometimes what they say to you about yourself is not altogether true, and almost every time you take the defensive and argue with them, as you get home and start thinking about it. And something, I mean, most of what Sigmund Freud said has since proved wrong. One thing he said is still in the psychology books. The thing we hate most about other people is the thing that we are, the thing that we are, and when you're onto it, watch, why do I hate this person? Then you start to do, I really ever do this? In most cases, when you're really honest with yourself, yes, you are doing it, and you didn't realize it was wrong. You may have realized wrong, but you didn't realize you were doing it. So no group, again, is above criticism. As far as what's going to happen in the future, Islam has not quit fighting for 1,400 years. Long, long time. And this war that's going on, that the Crusades were part of years and years ago, that Muhammad started, is eventually going to end when one side is left standing. And I have no idea which side that's going to be. In the conflict between the civilized and uncivilized down through the ages, the uncivilized have much too often won. And one of the reasons is they tend to have more children. They also tend to fight with more ruthlessness. But also, the civilized people try to placate them. And we have a president who's doing the same thing now. Try to make peace. Oh, it's so great to try to make peace with. Hey, Neville Chamberlain tried it with Hitler. Oh, you know, Neville Chamberlain made an agreement with Hitler that, hey, he guaranteed peace in our time. And he waved his papers, he got off the airplane. I spoke with him, so we were both committed to peace. Within a couple of days, Hitler had broken a treaty and invaded Poland. This is standard fundamental history. Most of you probably have heard it. How many ever heard Neville Chamberlain? So, he guaranteed peace. You can't deal with people who don't share your values, who are vowed they're going to conquer you, and they're going to find your weakness, and they're going to. All right. I've got to quit, folk. All right. Now, next time we'll take up Africa, and what I want to say about Africa right off the bat, Africa has been more involved in world history than we have realized. All down through the ages, African wares found their way into India, China, Japan, the islands of the Far East, and it appears that African sailors might have come to the Americas and founded a colony in Mexico. They have overspread the globe, and if Sir Lancelot existed, he might not even have known that his sword and his helmet and his armor might have come from Africa. Africa has more natural resources than any other continent on the face of the earth, and these resources have found their way all over the globe. With that, folk, you are dismissed. I'll see you on Wednesday.